This is the Investor Connect podcast program. I'm Health Martin. I'm the host of this show in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, family offices, private equity, and many other investors for early stage and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Grace Lee, CEO of Health Enovation. Health Enovation provides incubator and investor funding for health tech, wellness, and patient data analytics. They help startup entrepreneurs design the business and build engaging technology to aggregate and facilitate health data management. They aim to help startups realize the missing components of their business that will determine if they succeed or fail. They facilitate angel investors for pharma, insurance, and healthcare in finding, evaluating, and conducting due diligence to invest in health and wellness tech startups. And they aim to minimize the regulatory, clinical, legal, and financial risk. Grace, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me here. Excited to speak on the topics that we're going to embark on.
So what was your background before investing in early stage companies? What did you do before this?
Sure. I've been in healthcare for 25 years, starting out with the launch of Lipitor, Viagra, and Neurontin back in the blockbuster days. I was also in academia with cancer research and discovering ways to cure cancer. Then went on to develop new Alzheimer's drugs, and then ultimately went on to the CRO side, responsible for the drug development and strategy, regulatory strategy for 116 companies around the world. Ended up in management consulting and helping government, pharma companies, and biotech build technology that integrates data and to be able to leapfrog both their competition, but also for epidemic and disease management.
Great. So what excites you right now?
Well, obviously, we're in the middle of the COVID epidemic. And while as much as it's a sad state of affairs for the world, I think that the ability for technology, for startups, and for government and private sector to work together to solve some very fundamental problems and issues in our healthcare system, but also in our research capacity. And what generally has been the challenge throughout history of healthcare is that everything is siloed. Data is siloed, our multiple stakeholders, patients, doctors, the payers are all siloed. So there's no real central repository for truth. And so I think given that everyone is now working from home and trying to solve a world epidemic from various locations around the world, it gives us an opportunity to look at disruption of the current state of affairs by building technology and collaborations that cross borders, that cross database silos, and to really solve problems that will be our world from this point forward. I don't see us going backwards anymore once we've discovered that telemedicine is just as good as being on site. And especially when we're talking about remote regions, like we're having the African countries leapfrog the first world countries by building technology and infrastructure that enables connectivity, both on the data level and as well as on the communication level. And by doing so, each of those countries can really address the needs of their citizens. So I'm very hopeful that in a historical context that we're all experiencing right now, the level of collaboration that we've seen between the scientists and the government and public sector, as well as the urgency for change, is certainly here.
Great. Well, you work with both investors and startups. What's your advice for people investing in startups in the healthcare sector? What do you tell them to do before they write that first check?
Always consider who their audience is. I think there's a lot of idealism with regard to startups in the health and wellness space looking to go to market with a product aiming to disrupt the current state, either from a social impact perspective or from a monetization perspective. And one of the hardest challenges is identifying the decision maker and the actual payer of that service. What I often find in pitches to me with regard to startups is that they think everyone will pay for it. And that's really the challenge here, is that when you have a nice to have, let's say a tracker or a compliance monitor or any sort of those devices, IoT or app-based, you have to really consider who gets the most benefit from paying for that service. Usually the patients are not the ones paying for it. And if they are, they really need to see a benefit right away. And so a lot of the B2C type of startups really have a huge 5 to 10 year challenge getting a change in behavior of the patients and the public to be able to either input data on a consistent basis to make the data valuable, or use the feedback from the technology enough that they're willing to pay for that level of change. I also see the other side of things where startups have an idealistic view that pharma companies, government, and insurance companies are automatically going to shell out millions of dollars for the platform or the technology that they're about to build. And having been in the industry, having been in the decision-making corner office and being an investor in this space, it's really hard to get to that wallet through which a company or a government or a organization feels that this is big enough of a problem for them to throw money at, especially when you don't have a name behind you, a brand, a credible brand. So those are the two areas that's been really plaguing most startups since the start of the healthcare health tech bubble. And we've seen traction with some of the kits that have been out there. We've seen traction with some of the monitors that are out there. But ultimately, to get real monetization that will sustain itself, it needs to be an industry-wide implementation. And that's where coalitions are really going to be the key to unlocking this type of change, either on the patient side, on the doctor and physician side, or on the payer side.
Great. So let's talk about the state of healthcare investing. How do you see the industry evolving post-COVID?
Well, I think the interest is certainly there. Any product or service that was COVID related certainly had a lot of funding over the last 12 months. I also think that anyone who jumped into either the testing area, PPE area, or any sort of telemedicine area, as an investor learned the hard way that even with an epidemic, those areas are pretty tough to penetrate. And so what I would see the investors veering towards is looking at sustainability beyond COVID and to look at these solutions as an ability to pivot or be sustainable beyond an epidemic condition of the world. And whether it's using COVID as a proof of concept or that through COVID, you get the collaboration of the key stakeholders to gain trust in the technology being built or to realize how they could implement it within their ecosystem. And that's really the entrenchment that will make us a health tech startup successful. So I'm hopeful that the health tech investors will start to see which startups are able to go for the marathon as opposed to the current emergency at the moment, and really see some returns on their investments in that way.
Great. So let's talk about your investment thesis. What exactly is it for the healthcare sector and what's your criteria?
My criteria is user first. However the startup defines the user, whether it's a corporate user or a patient user. A lot of technology that I've seen being presented or developed today focus on data. So they design it from a data perspective, the structure of the data or the flow of the data, rather than usability and what actual problem it's solving for the user. And without solving the user problem, it just becomes another database, another dashboard per se. And so the challenge in adoptability is, well, if I can do everything by paper, manually, or go around it in 3 shorter ways, then I'll just do that. It's much harder to get someone to continually use a device or a technology more than once, unless you can prove that it is valuable for more than one use case. So let's say an example of a lot of the technology for COVID right now is, let's say, how to find testing facilities or how to diagnose your symptoms. The challenge is there really is once they've done it once, they won't use it again, right? And so if you look at government or business technology, it's even worse because once they implement a sample of it, if the employees don't see a value in it more than once, then really it's not going to be sustainable or entrenched to make change in the industry.
Right. And so what are the challenges in the healthcare space for the investor? What does the investor face when trying to fund startups in the healthcare space?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I've been advising other investors for about 15 years now. And these include Wall Street investment bankers and VCs and PE and the angel investors. And I think what most investors underestimate is the regulatory aspect of healthcare. One easy example is GDPR or just HIPAA. I think most startups misunderstand what GDPR and HIPAA mean with regard to that every data point, if it's downloaded on any laptop or personal device, is a violation of HIPAA and GDPR. And so this is an example where the understanding of how long it takes, let's say, to get through phase 1, 2, 3 of drug development or device development and to get approval, or the amount of effort it takes to create security around the data collection, analysis, reporting, and distribution. These are things that startups that are outside the healthcare system really are not familiar with. They have an idealistic view that, oh yeah, everyone will download data and that'd be fine. But when we come to California's new rules on data privacy, or Europe is becoming more stringent, nothing that we develop can be in isolation of those two major jurisdictions, right? So I would advise any investors that if you're being pitched a product or a service, get a good understanding of whether the startup founder and the team has advisors or personal experience going through the regulatory and compliance aspects of healthcare.
Right. So you see a lot of subsectors and applications in the healthcare space. If you had to pick one or two to put at the top of the list that you think are good opportunities today, what would you put at the top?
Well, I think if you look at today, what are the biggest challenges we're trying to solve? Logistics. I think supply chain logistics of, I'll give an easy example that everyone's familiar with. How to get enough vaccines. Where does the vaccine get distributed to? Who gets access to those vaccines? How do you prioritize the order at which vaccine is distributed? Once you have vaccine available and distributed, how do you document it and make it available for use in practical applications such as getting on a plane or entering the workplace? So there you have an entire supply chain challenge that remains to be solved. And it's almost like 9/11, where we thought, yes, it was a catastrophic event, but we didn't realize that TSA was completely going to change our lives after 9/11. And I think same thing here, that we're really not going to come out of this epidemic in the near future. I think even if every country has the ability to manage through the supply chain fast enough, we have 7 billion people to vaccinate. So just the logistical challenge of getting that achieved. Until that is achieved, we will need to prove our antibody status, our infection status, and our vaccination status. And we have a huge challenge coming up in terms of how do you validate that piece of paper? How trustworthy is that piece of paper, the yellow card that we used to trust in the past, to enable someone to get on a plane and travel to another country and reinfect a country if that piece of paper was fraudulent. So I can see a lot of new technology coming out in the near future, just dealing with integrity, data integrity, and to validate that that stamp is indeed coming from a real vaccine with a real, serial number, and that's not a replica. And how do we validate that on a yellow card? We can't. In the past, we really didn't have an issue with that, because if we talk about measles, mumps, or rubella, yeah, you couldn't go to school without it, but you could travel around the world. But now that we're in a situation where each country is going to be highly impacted by who they let in, what we're working on at Million Patients Cured is working with various governments to create the roadmap to how they're going to manage not only their internal citizens, but the influx and outflux of people as the vaccination status fluctuates throughout the course of the next 3 years. And what's going to complicate it even further is, as we see in the South Africa situation, the virus is mutating faster than our vaccines are. So the AstraZeneca vaccine that is in South Africa is actually not effective for the South African strain. So we're playing a sort of a race, a game against the virus's mutation capabilities while trying to build an infrastructure that is akin to our reaction with TSA, and to really look at how do you monitor compliance, migration, and validity of disease status and vaccination. And I think that this is going to evolve to change a lot of identity, change a lot of flow of people in and out of buildings and countries and transport. And any companies that are working on this now really will be part of the revolution.
Great. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
Well, I think I represent a group of 300 female investors that invest in other female founders. And given the last few years and the rising up of female founders, as the last 2 weeks, we saw that Bumble was able to achieve something that most would not have considered as possible in a very crowded space such as dating apps. But as a female founder, she was able to evolve a concept well beyond the original intent to business networking and friendships. And if you can see how difficult it is for all of us working from home to connect with another individual from another circle, you can see how this type of technology, just in the same way as Zoom zoomed up during the epidemic, we can see that in the future, this ability for multiple circles to connect will be even harder. So I present this as an example in that female founders are looking at different ways and multiple dimensions of how to impact the world, and the technology and the services and the companies that female founders are developing are often unaddressed so far in the history of investing. So I encourage other investors to look at female founders, but also for female founders to realize that there are going to be a momentum to support these unmet needs, and that there are organizations such as Pipeline Angels and 37 Angels that would support the type of efforts that female founders are basically pioneering. And so I'm hopeful that in the next few years, we'll see more and more of these IPOs and these unicorns come out of spaces that were previously unaddressed and led by female founders looking at the world's problems in a different way.
That's great. So how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Sure. Best email is probably grace.lee@healthinnovation.com. I'm usually accessible there or on our websites on Million Patients Cured or healthinnovation.com. And happy to chat with any startups in this space that would be curious to how to get into the industry and get through the muster that is needed from a regulatory or from a user acceptability standpoint.
Great. We'll put those in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us today and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you, and good luck with everything.
You as well.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org.
Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall in podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for the basis of investment decisions.